I think we as manga fans all love a long-running series every once in a while. If you find a story and characters that you really love, then it's only natural to not want the adventure to end. And before you know it, you've been up all night reading only to realize that you've only barely scratched the surface. We've all been there, and that can be a really great feeling. But these types of series can be hard to get into, as they are often a huge time investment. Look, I get it. It can be hard to get into something new, especially when you're so busy reading through One Piece for the 11th time. That's why I'm here, to show off some of my favorite manga that offers a concise story that you can pretty much read through in a single weekend. Before we get started though, I should put down some ground rules. What exactly should we define as a short manga? Well, for this list, I decided to put a hard limit at 10 volumes. Some of you might still say that's too long, but I think it's a good length where you can easily tell a complete story without it dragging its feet at any point. Obviously, the manga has to be finished and tell a complete story from start to finish to be eligible. And I also decided to limit it to manga that has an official English translation. For each entry, I'll present a category of sorts, in which I will talk about some similar works to the actual slot holder. You can view these other series that I mentioned as a sort of honorable mentions if you'd like. Alright, that's enough for introductions. Let's get to the first entry. To start things off, I want to dedicate the number 5 slot to the weirdos, to the stories where everything won't necessarily be clear until you dig a little deeper. These are the stories that I love to come back to, because I know that I'm likely to find something new to appreciate that I may not have seen the first time through. Inyo Asano's Nijigahara Holograph is a trippy single-volume journey through the dark history of a small rural area that I still don't know if I've wrapped my head around completely. And I love how Taiyo Matsumoto depicts people's connections to a broken city in Tekkon Kincrete. Ultimately though, I have to give this spot to Tsutomu Nihei's magnum opus, Blam. Blam is such a fascinating manga, managing to be so somber and calm at times, while at other times being so violent and grotesque. So many pages are just dedicated to these huge landscape shots of Kiri traveling across the huge structures that make up the city, really giving you a sense of scale and how impossible his mission seems. In very few words, Blam manages to show off its incredible yet dying world, and to tell the hopeless and solitary tale of those who are trying to save it, despite all the horror that makes you wonder if there is really anything left to save at all. The real star here though has to be Nihei's incredible artwork. While the way he draws characters' faces may take some time getting used to, the insane level of detail in the architecture of his backgrounds, as well as his absolutely horrifying monster designs, are just breathtaking. That combined with the rich but hidden lore behind its characters and world will always make Blam a joy to revisit every so often. For the number 4 slots, I decided to take a look at a manga that, despite its short length, still manages to create a huge epic tale with its own original world. Like how Katsuhiro Otomo beautifully paints the destruction of society in Akira, or how Yukito Kishiro takes us on a journey of violence and self-discovery in Battle Angel Alita. I was actually really close to giving this spot to Alita, with how close that story is to my heart, but I couldn't really do it in good faith with the argument that the story isn't really complete without the sequel series, The Mask Chronicles. Instead, I will give the number 5 slots to an absolute fantasy classic in Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. As far as epic fantasy adventures go, Nausicaa pretty much has it all. A well-defined, interesting world, fantastical creatures interacting with said world in meaningful ways, political drama, and several independent storylines all coming together in a great way. which very much is thanks to the character of Nausicaa herself. These types of chosen one stories can be pretty hard to do right, with a very large part of the narrative coming down to the portrayal of the character in question and their actions. A very common trap being making them strictly reactionary and boring. But contrary to that, Nausicaa is very much a proactive participant in this story. She has her own agenda and morals that she acts from, and her actions play a very active role in changing the world, without it ever feeling like the world strictly revolves around her. And although she's clearly a character meant to represent the best parts of humanity, she doesn't ever feel like she's meant to be anything more than just a human. She knows that there are limits to how far idealism can take you, and is willing to make certain sacrifices for the greater good. She is constantly being torn between her love for humanity and her sometimes blind hatred for their actions, leading to some very interesting moral dilemmas late in the story. All in all, I think Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind is one of the best classic fantasy stories out there, and it all comes packaged in a very manageable 7 volumes. If you still haven't checked it out, it's definitely worth your time. The number 3 spot is all about the atmosphere. Here I want to give credit to the manga that really just gives off the feeling of calmness and harmony with the worlds. Where the number 4 slot was a celebration of the grand, epic type of storytelling, this is about the complete opposite of that. Like how Makimoto Yukimura's Planet Tess uses the vastness of space to show its characters how insignificant they are, and how they come to accept that. Or how Tsukimisu's Girl's Last Tour reflects on life and history through 2 regular girls who find themselves at the end of both. These stories make it clear that what you're seeing is only a very small part of a much grander world, and their short length only helps enforce this feeling. And for this, I can think of no better candidate than one of my favorite manga of all time, Yuki Urashibara's Mushishi. In case you don't know, Mushishi is essentially a collection of short stories, all centered around its main character Ginkgo, as he travels around as a Mushishi. His job is to study creatures known as Mushi, which are small beings which inhabit the world. Mushi are invisible to most people and come in many different forms with mysterious powers. Each chapter of the manga is generally its own separate story, centering around the Mushi and the people's relationship with them. One thing that I love so much about this manga is that while there is some elements of an overarching plot around Ginkgo and his past, each story can pretty much be read on its own, and they're generally speaking not really about Ginkgo at all, but about different people and their relationships with nature, the supernatural, death, and each other. These stories can range between happy, tragic, mysterious, horrifying, and serene, but there's always a theme of living in harmony with nature and accepting that one is only a small part of a vast world that we will never fully understand. Some of these stories could probably easily be made into an entire series on its own, but instead, Mushishi would rather show you only a small part of these people's lives before moving on to the next, as there are always more stories to be told. There are really only 2 things that are holding this series back from being even higher on the list. One is that, while the manga is great, Mushishi also has a fantastic anime adaptation that is already pretty well known. The other is that while Kodansha did publish an English release of this about 10 years ago, these copies are really hard to come by, and so your options for reading this legally are very limited. Even so, I would highly encourage anyone who hasn't already experienced this series in one form or another to give it a chance. It's truly a masterpiece. The category for the number 2 slot is a rather extensive one, as I would here like to look at the genre that arguably thrives the most in this short-length format, namely the simple human drama. Where all the other series on this list up until now have featured their own original worlds, these are the stories that simply follow regular people in our world living their lives. They can be stories of belonging, of romance, of finding meaning in the things you love, of meetings and of farewells, of all the little things that make up everyday life. Inuasa no Solanin, Yoshitoki Oima's A Silent Voice, and Yuki Kamatani's Our Dreams at Dusk are only a few of my favorites here, but for me this spot has to go to one of the kings of this genre, Taiyo Matsumoto. And while I do think that Sunny is a great and very underappreciated series of his, when it comes to capturing human emotion in manga, very few series out there can stand up to his Ping Pong. Now, I've talked about this series before on this channel, so in fear of repeating myself too much, I'll keep this rather brief. Ping Pong is just kind of everything I look for in a story like this. It takes a simple topic, in this case the sport of ping pong, and looks at it from pretty much all possible angles. People who have passion, people who have talents, people who have both, or people who have neither. No one can say what the correct way to go about it is, and it's hard to say whether or not there is any happiness to be found at all until you stand on the peak. And at that point, it might already be too late to turn back. At what point is it time to stop dreaming and look at the cold reality of it all? Is there such a point at all? These questions will never have a definitive answer, as such an answer will depend heavily on who you ask. And it's by showing off all these ways of going about things that Ping Pong stops being a sports manga and becomes a reflection of life itself. And guess what? Life sucks! It really sucks! And it sucks super hard when you're trying to go about it on your own. But hey, that's what heroes are for, isn't it? When I was deciding on what to put for the number 1 spots, I was kinda unsure how to go about it. Should I just go with my favourite, the one I think about the most, the one I think has the most well-crafted story, the easiest one to get into? In the end, I decided that the number 1 should be the manga that best encapsulates the spirit of the list, so to say. That is, a compact story with a clear closure that is easy for pretty much anyone to just pick up and read over the weekend. And with that being said, despite it probably being the most boring and predictable answer I could have come up with, the manga that I chose was none other than Naoki Urasawa's Pluto. What can I really say about Pluto? It's just a goddamn good story. The premise is rather simple. We find ourselves in a futuristic society where AI technology has reached the state where robots can function in society on pretty much the same level as regular humans. The story starts off with the murder of world-renowned robot Mont Blanc in Switzerland. It soon becomes obvious that someone is trying to kill off the world's 7 most advanced robots one by one, and it's the job of our protagonist, Gesicht, a detective working for the European police, who himself is one of the aforementioned 7 robots, to solve the case. This case also seems to be connected to the murder on several human key figures in robot development and research, and the mysteries only grow from there. If you read any Urasawa work like Monster or 20th Century Boys before, then you should know that writing compelling mysteries is his forte, and of course Pluto is no exception. The way he can weave so many different storylines and characters into one big connected web is truly masterful. Each character has their unique personality, flaws and motivations that tie them into the overarching mystery, that make them all seem so human, ironically enough. There are times when it no longer feels like I'm reading a manga, but rather some European crime drama. And then it suddenly cuts to some big epic robot battle in the sky, and I'm like, yeah, this is good too. While I don't really think that Pluto is a perfect story, there are parts of it that I feel could have been expanded more upon or just cut out completely. Overall, I would say that if you're looking for a short, satisfying and entertaining read, you definitely can't go wrong with this one. So there you have it, my top 5 short manga list. Let me know if you'd like to see more of this type of videos, and potentially what other topics you would like me to cover. Also, if your favorite manga wasn't mentioned, then there's probably a good chance that I simply haven't read it yet. So if that is the case, please let me know what you would have put on there. I'm always looking for good recommendations. And hey, you know what? Even if your favorites were talked about in the video, feel free to share your own list in the comments below. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. This has been Avantgarde, and I'll see you next time.